What's going on, guys? Welcome to Danny Wright's Dragon Stories. In a world where dragons and humans unite, kindness becomes strength, and friendship creates legend. So let's dive into the story.
The posting came with a single line of note at the bottom of the transfer document. It read, Foundational Studies, ALC Verith. Low enrollment. Low priority. Immediate placement. David Rail read it twice on the transport ship, folded the paper, and put it in his front pocket. He did not read it a third time. There was no point. He had already accepted. The Accords Educational Board had been clear that this was the only position available to a human educator at this time. They had not said it unkindly. They had said it the way a person states the weather. The transport docked at Orbital Station Verith 9 in the early part of the station's artificial day cycle. The light in the docking bay was a pale blue-white, clean and cold. David picked up his single bag and followed the directional arrows on the floor toward the main corridor. Around him, a dozen other species moved with purpose. A pair of tall Selith in layered gray coats. A cluster of Felhari students with quick eyes and faster feet. A turban administrator scrolling through something on a handheld device, mandibles moving in what might have been counting. Nobody looked at David. This was fine. He was used to it. A junior aide named Wes was waiting near the academy entrance. Wes was a young Durin, small and round-shouldered, with the kind of expression that suggested he had drawn the short end of something that morning. He greeted David with a formal nod and began walking immediately, as if staying still too long might make the task more real. "I'll show you the classroom first," Wes said, his translator clipping his vowels into something neat and slightly flat. "Then the staff wing. Then the resource room." David followed. He did not talk much while walking. He looked. ALC Verith was large in the way that orbital stations often were, not wide, but deep. Level after level stacked downward from the main hub, each one a little dimmer, a little quieter, a little further from the clean blue light of the docking bay. The upper rings were bright and well kept. Faculty quarters, senior student halls, the kind of corridors where your footsteps sounded deliberate. As Wes led him lower, the walls changed. Not badly, they were clean enough, but the light strips were older and gave off a slightly yellower glow. Signage was less frequent. Foot traffic thinned. Wes was moving quickly, the way someone moves through a place they'd rather not linger in. David slowed. There was a corridor to the left, a maintenance access passage by the look of it. Narrow, poorly lit. But as David slowed, he caught something that didn't belong to maintenance corridors. A piece of heat cloth, folded with some care, tucked against the base of a coolant pipe. Above it, low on the wall, faint scratches. Not random. They had pattern. He had spent enough time around students to know the difference between marks made out of boredom and marks made by someone trying to learn something. These were the second kind. There was a water collection cup balanced on a junction cap. It was positioned to catch condensation dripping from the pipe above it. The placement was deliberate. David stopped walking. Wes noticed after 3 more steps. He turned. "Mr. Rail? Who lives here?" David asked. Wes looked at the corridor. Something moved across his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite guilt. "No one," he said. David waited. "How many ward cases are there currently?" "1." Wes said it quietly, like a number that was smaller than it should be. "A Verith KYN Hatchling. His intake documentation has some outstanding items." Outstanding for how long? Wes checked his datapad. His expression did not change, but his pause was long enough to be its own kind of answer. 8 months, he said. David looked at the heat cloth again, at the cup, at the scratch marks on the wall that looked, from this angle, like someone trying to write a word in a script they were still learning. "What's the hatchling's name?" he asked. Wes scrolled. He scrolled further. His brow creased. The file lists a species designation code. Ward 7, Verith KYN, unclaimed. He looked up. "There's no name field populated." David said, "That's not a name." Wes looked at the datapad, then at David, as if checking whether this was a philosophical observation or an instruction. "No," he said carefully. "I suppose it isn't." The classroom was small. 2 rows of desks designed for 3 different body types, a display board, a single window port that looked out onto the maintenance ring. Not glamorous. David set his bag down and stood in the center of the room for a moment. He could work with this. The staff wing was adequate. His quarters were narrow but private. The resource room had less than he had hoped for, and more than he had expected. By the time Wes finished the tour and excused himself with visible relief, David had already decided what he needed to do next. He had not thought about it long. There was nothing complicated about it. A child had been in a maintenance corridor for 8 months with no name in any file and no class to attend, and everyone who walked past that corridor had looked somewhere else. David was not good at looking somewhere else. He went to find the ward clerk. Pessa sat behind a desk that was 3 times larger than she needed. She was a small Durin like Wes, but older, with ink-stained fingers and the calm of someone who had processed enough paperwork to make peace with most of what it contained. David introduced himself. He asked about the Verith KYN hatchling. Pessa pulled the file without being asked, the way a person pulls a file they have pulled before, but not recently enough. She summarized without much emotion. The egg had cracked 11 days before the bonding term window. Without a completed clutch group bond, the hatchling could not receive his formal Verith KYN naming. Without the naming, the species registry could not be finalized. Without the finalized registry, no enrollment could be processed. The file had been forwarded to the Verith KYN Administrative Council. The council met every 3 years. David listened to all of this. He let the silence after it sit for a moment. Then he said, "Has anyone spoken to the hatchling directly about any of this?" Pessa looked at him, not unkindly, but with the look of a person being asked about a thing that had not occurred to anyone as a necessary step. "He is a ward case," she said. "The counseling liaison handles ward cases." "I'd like to see the counseling liaison," David said. The counseling liaison, a senior Turvan administrator, met with David for 6 minutes. He said the hatchling was stable, non-disruptive, had not requested intervention. David said a child living in a maintenance corridor and not attending any classes was not stable. That was a child being invisible, which was a different thing. The administrator said he was unfamiliar with that distinction. David said he understood. He thanked him, and then he went down to the maintenance corridor himself. He did not bring the file. He did not bring his datapad. He brought nothing except himself, and when he turned into the dim corridor and saw the small gray shape tucked behind a coolant pipe, tracing something on the wall with one claw, he did not announce himself loudly. He walked slowly, and he sat down on the floor across from the hatchling, at the same level, with the same amount of floor between them as felt right. The hatchling went still. One pale amber, I turned toward him. David did not smile too wide. He did not speak too quickly. He said, in a plain and even voice, "I'm going to be teaching foundational studies here. I was told there was no name on your file." The hatchling watched him. The claw stopped moving on the wall. "I'd like to know what to call you," David said. The silence lasted a long time, long enough that another person might have filled it. David didn't. Then, very quietly, from behind the pipe, "I am called nothing here." David said, "That's not an answer. That's an absence." Another silence, shorter this time. Before, the small voice said, "My egg mother called me Reich." Before she left, David nodded once. He said, "Reich." He said it the way you say something you are choosing to remember. Not gently, not with special weight. Just clearly, like a word that belongs in the air. "That's a good name," he said. He sat with the hatchling a little while longer. Not talking, just present. And when he left, he went straight back to Pessa's desk. He told her he wanted the student file updated. The name field, Reich. Pessa said she could not alter official species registry records. David said, "Then put it in the notes field. Every free field you have, whatever you can enter." Pessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she began to type. "And enroll him in my class," David said. Pessa's fingers paused, then kept going. 3 days passed before David went back to the maintenance corridor. He did not rush it. Reich had spent 8 months learning that people who appeared in his space either needed something from the pipes or were there to tell him something was still being processed. A man who showed up, sat on the floor, asked his name, and then left was not yet a pattern. It was just an event. David understood the difference. In those 3 days, he prepared his classroom, reviewed the student list Pessa had given him, and spent one long afternoon reading everything the Academy's library system had on Verith KYN culture. The reading was useful, not because it told him what to do. It told him what he was dealing with. The Verith KYN were an old species. Proud, in the way that very old species often were, not arrogantly, but with the settled certainty of those who have watched other civilizations rise and collapse while their own traditions held. Their hatchlings were bonded to clutch groups before their eyes fully opened. The bonding was not just social. It was legal. It was identity. A Verith Kyn who had not been named in ceremony was, by their own cultural law, not yet a person in any complete sense. Not dismissed. Not hated. Just incomplete. A draft of something waiting to be signed. Reich had been a draft for 8 months. David also pulled the Accord academic code. All of it. It was long. He read the relevant sections 3 times and made notes in the margin of his paper copy, because he thought better on paper. Most of what he found confirmed what Pesa had told him. But he had learned, over the years, that the most important things in any code were usually not in the parts people quoted from memory. They were in the subclauses and the exception frameworks. He marked 2 sections and put a question mark next to both. On the 4th morning, he went back. Reich was in the same place. Behind the pipe, in the corner where the wall met the floor, in the posture of a small creature that had gotten good at taking up as little space as possible. He was not tracing on the wall this time. He was still. His pale amber eyes opened when David turned into the corridor, and he watched, and he did not move, and he did not speak. David sat down across from him. Same distance as before. Same level. He said, "I'm going to start teaching next week. I wanted to ask if you'd like to come." Reich looked at him. "I have no enrollment," he said. His voice was small. Not soft exactly. More like a voice that had learned to stay inside a certain size. "I asked Pesa to enroll you," David said. "She cannot. My clutch documentation." "I know," David said. "I read the file." He paused. "I'm working on the documentation part. But I want to know if you actually want to come to class. Before I do any of that." Reich blinked. It was a slow blink, both eyes, the kind that on his species probably meant something more than surprise. He looked at David the way someone looks at a door they haven't considered opening. "What would I learn?" Reich asked. "Foundational studies," David said. "Communication. How different species send and receive information. How language works across biology. How to think about thinking." He kept it plain. No added enthusiasm. No performance. It's useful regardless of what you do after. Reich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No one has asked me what I wanted. Here." David did not respond to this with anything large. He just said, "I'm asking." Another pause. Long, but not uncomfortable. Reich looked at the scratches on the wall, the ones David had noticed on the first day. Then he looked back. "Yes," Reich said. "I want to come." David nodded once. "Good." He stood up slowly. "One more thing. Your name." "Reich." "I'll use it. In class, in any documentation I can put it in, anytime I address you. If anyone asks me your designation code, I'll tell them your name is Reich, and they can look the code up themselves." He said this plainly, not as a speech, just as information. Something in Reich's posture shifted. Not dramatically. He didn't stand straighter or lift his head, but something that had been very tight in the set of his small shoulders eased by one small degree. David left him and went to speak to the counseling liaison again. The Turvan administrator received him with visible patience and the expression of a person who had hoped this particular human was finished. David sat down without being invited and put his paper notes on the desk. "I've been reading the academic code," David said. "Section 7.14 requires enrolled students to carry species-recognized identity documentation. That's the section being used to block enrollment." He tapped the paper. "But Section 4.2b, the sponsorship exception clause, allows for a recognized adult member of the Accord to take academic responsibility for a student whose species documentation is in active processing." The administrator looked at the paper without touching it. "Sponsorship is handled by same-species adults," he said. "The clause says recognized adult member of the Accord," David said. "It does not specify same species." I looked. 3 times. Silence. "That has never been applied cross-species," the administrator said. "I know," David said. "Has it ever been prohibited?" The administrator did not answer immediately. He reached over and pulled up his own copy of the code on the display. He read. He read again. His mandibles moved in small, tight motions. He looked up. "This would need to go to the headmaster." "I know," David said. "Can you schedule that meeting?" The administrator scheduled it for the following day. He did this with the air of a person who hoped the headmaster would shut it down cleanly, so everyone could stop talking about the maintenance corridor and the gray hatchling and the human teacher who apparently had nothing better to do than read the academic code in its entirety. The next morning, Reich appeared at the classroom door at 7 minutes before the listed start time. He stood in the doorframe and did not come in. David was arranging papers on his desk. He looked up. "You're early," he said. "That's fine. Come in." Reich came in. He moved along the wall, which was the behavior of a creature that had gotten used to staying close to exits, and sat at the desk furthest from the other seats. He placed both forelimbs flat on the desk and looked at the front of the room. The other students arrived over the next several minutes. A Felhari girl named Naro, quick and bright-eyed, who sat in the middle. Two Turvan brothers who always sat together. A Seleth student who moved slowly and deliberately and never seemed to be in a hurry. A handful of others. When they saw Reich, they looked. Not cruelly, most of them. Just the look of creatures registering something unexpected. Naro whispered something to the student next to her. Reich went still. David began the lesson. The first thing he did, before anything else, was call roll. He did it differently than most instructors. He did not read a name and wait for an answer. He looked at each student and said, "Tell me your name. How you want it said." He went around the room. Each student stated their name. David repeated it back. If he got it wrong, the click in the Turvan name, the doubled vowel in the Seleth name, he asked to be corrected. He did not apologize excessively. He just adjusted and moved on. When he reached the back of the room, he looked at Reich. Reich looked back. The whole class was watching without looking like they were watching, which was something students were universally good at. David said, "Take your time." The silence was brief. Then, in a voice that was small but did not waver, "Reich." David repeated it back exactly. The same syllable, the same weight. He said, "Is that right?" Reich nodded once. "Good," David said. "Welcome to class, Reich." He said it the way he had said all the others. Not with more gentleness. Not with less. The same weight as every other name in the room. He moved on to the lesson. He taught for 45 minutes about multi-species communication. He used examples from human history not because human history was the most important history, but because he knew it best, and he was honest about that fact when he stated it. He talked about a group of early human explorers who failed in navigation because they used a map made by someone who had never been to the place. He talked about a later group of diplomats who succeeded in a negotiation because one of them spent 3 months learning not just the language but the silences of the other culture. When to speak, when to wait, what the waiting meant. He asked questions during the lesson, not to test, to hear. He pointed to different students and asked what they thought, and he listened to the answers fully before responding. He asked Reich, "What is the most important thing about sending a message?" Reich startled slightly. He had not expected to be asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and David let it be quiet. Then Reich said, "That someone receives it." David said, "Almost. That someone is there to receive it. There's a difference." He did not explain the difference immediately. He let it sit in the room. He watched the students chew on it. Reich most of all, the pale amber eyes going slightly inward, turning something over. He moved on. After class, when the others had filed out, Reich stayed at his desk for a moment. Not because David had asked him to. He just sat there, looking at the front board where a diagram of signal pathways between 3 different species' sensory organs was still displayed. David erased the board slowly, giving him the time. Eventually Reich stood. He walked to the door. He paused there. "You said," he began. "Someone must be there to receive it." "Yes," David said. "Before," Reich said, "when I was in the corridor, I would trace words on the wall, in Verith Kyn script, just to practice. But there was no one to read them." He did not say this sadly. He said it as a fact, in the way a student reports an observation. David looked at him. "There is now," he said. Reich left. David stood in the empty classroom for a moment. Through the small window port, the maintenance ring was visible below, a lattice of pipes and gray metal and utility corridors where, 8 months ago, a small gray hatchling had arrived with no name in his file and no class to attend, and everyone who passed had kept walking. The meeting with the headmaster was tomorrow. David picked up his paper notes and his marked copy of the academic code, and he went to prepare. Headmaster Orvin had the kind of stillness that came from many years of making decisions that other people then had to live with. He was Seleth, tall and gray-skinned, with 4 dark eyes that moved independently and a voice that was always exactly as loud as it needed to be. His office was orderly in a way that suggested the order was meaningful rather than decorative. There were no unnecessary objects on his desk. The ones that were there all had a function. He read David's formal request in silence. He read it the way experienced administrators read things they already know they will have to respond to carefully, not quickly, not slowly, but with the patience of a person checking every word against a mental checklist. When he finished, he set it down. He did not look up immediately. "Mr. Rail," he said at last, "you are aware that this has never been done." "Cross-species academic sponsorship," David said. "Yes, I know. The Verith Kyn Cultural Council will likely view it as interference." "I imagined so." Orvin finally looked up. His 4 eyes settled on David with calm, focused attention. "Why do it then? This student is not enrolled in your class. He is not your responsibility." David said, "He came to my class yesterday. He arrived 7 minutes early. He sat quietly. He answered a question in class. He had not spoken in an academic setting in 8 months. He paused, and when I asked him to tell me his name, he did it in a voice that was ready to be ignored. He was ready for me not to care. He had already practiced not being disappointed." Orvin was quiet. "That did not happen in 8 months on its own," David said. "That was practiced. And whoever let him practice that for 8 months wasn't paying attention." He said this without accusation, just as an observation, a fact being entered into the room. Orvin looked at the request again. He pulled up the academic code on his display. He navigated with the precision of someone who had memorized the index. He found the section. He read it. He read the subclauses. He went back up and read them again. "The language does say recognized adult member of the Accord," he said. Not to David. More to himself, or to the code. "It does," David said. "This will create administrative friction." Orvin closed the file and opened it again. "The Verith Kyn representative to this station will formally object. It will go to the Accord Educational Oversight Board. There may be a review of my administration's handling of the ward case." "There probably should be," David said quietly. Orvin looked at him. Something in the headmaster's expression shifted, not warmly, but with the look of a person reassessing what kind of thing they are dealing with. "If I approve this preliminary filing," Orvin said, "it is exactly that. Preliminary. It grants you no cultural authority over the hatchling. It only allows his provisional enrollment while the species documentation is in processing. That's all I'm asking for," David said. "I want him in a classroom, learning, while the paperwork sorts itself out." Orvin looked at the request one more time. He picked up his authorization tool. He paused. "Mr. Rail," he said, "you are a very stubborn species." David said, "We've been told." Orvin authorized the preliminary filing. Word moved through ALC Verith the way word always moved through institutions, faster than it should, and with additional detail it had not started with. By the end of that day, there were several versions of the story circulating. In one, the human teacher had argued with the headmaster for 3 hours and threatened to involve the Accord human representative. In another, the hatchling in the underblock had attacked a student and the human teacher had covered it up. In the most dramatic version, which was also the least accurate, David had somehow forged enrollment documents. The true version was less dramatic. A human teacher had read the academic code carefully and found a clause that had been there all along. This was, in some ways, more unsettling to people than any of the dramatic versions. Among the students who heard about it, reactions varied. Most of the upper ring students found it baffling. Why would an educator risk his standing for a ward case with no documentation? The Verith Kyn were respected. Upsetting their cultural council over a single unclaimed hatchling seemed like poor politics. Some found it faintly ridiculous. A few found it interesting in the way that unusual things are interesting, briefly, and from a distance. Naro, the Felhuri student from David's foundational class, heard 3 different versions in the same corridor within 20 minutes. She was quick in most ways, and one of the ways she was quick was in noticing when a thing was being talked about by people who did not have the full information. She went down to the underblock that evening, not out of great courage, more out of curiosity, and something else she didn't yet have a word for. Reich was in his usual corner. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and he went still, ready to be unnoticed. Naro stopped at the entrance to the corridor. She stood there a moment, then sat down on the floor in the opening, close enough to talk, but not so close as to be in his space. I heard the teacher filed something, she said. For you. Reich looked at her. I thought you should know, she said. In case you didn't. I knew, Reich said. Oh. Naro looked at the floor. Is it strange that a human did it? Reich thought about this. He is the only one who asked my name, he said finally. So no, it is not strange. It is just what he does. Naro nodded slowly. She looked around the corridor. At the heat cloth, the condensation cup, the scratch marks on the wall. She looked at all of it long enough to actually see it, which is different from glancing. She said, "This is where you live." Yes, Reich said. She didn't say anything about that. She didn't say it was terrible or unfair or that something should be done. She just sat with the fact of it for a moment, the way David had sat across from Reich in the same corridor, not filling the space with noise. I'll see you in class tomorrow, she said. She got up and left. That night, Reich moved his heat cloth. He had always kept it at the far back of the corridor, pressed against the deepest wall, the way you keep yourself in the place that is hardest to reach. He moved it to a spot near the entrance. Not because he was less afraid, because there was something small and unfamiliar settling in his chest, and he didn't know what to call it yet, but it felt like the difference between hiding and waiting. In the following days, the classroom changed in small ways that nobody announced. David taught his lessons the same way each time. Questions first, facts after, discussion always. He called names correctly. He corrected himself when he didn't. He never spoke faster than the slowest processor in the room, and he never made anyone feel that the pace was a concession to them rather than simply the right speed for the information. Reich answered questions when asked. Then, 3 days in, he answered one that hadn't been directed at him specifically. David had asked the room in general whether they could think of a case where receiving a message correctly was more important than sending it clearly. Most students gave the expected answers. Reich, from the back, said, "When the sender cannot say it again." The room went quiet for a half-second. David looked at him. "Give me an example," he said. Reich said, "If something happens only once, and the signal is brief, and the receiver is not ready, the message is lost, not because it was sent badly, but because no one was there to catch it." David said, "That's exactly right. And that's the harder problem. You can train a sender. It's much harder to train the world to be ready." After class that day, Naro didn't leave immediately. She stayed at her desk a moment, turned in her seat, and looked at Reich. "That was a good answer," she said. Reich looked at her. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either, which was its own kind of answer. Instructor Balek found David in the faculty corridor on the 5th day. Balek was Turvin, senior faculty, with the settled confidence of a person who had been at the institution long enough to know what it was and was comfortable with that knowledge. He was not hostile to David. He was something quieter, dismissive in the way that very large things are dismissive of very small things, not with effort, but by default. "I hear you filed a sponsorship claim," Balek said. "Preliminary filing," David said. "Yes." "Irregular," Balek said. He did not say it as a judgment. He said it the way you state a category. "The code allows it," David said. "The code allows a great many things that are not done," Balek said. "Because the Accord is built on social architecture that functions because everyone understands which parts of the code are used and which are merely present." He paused. "You are disrupting that architecture." "I'm enrolling a student," David said. "You are complicating a situation that was being managed." David stopped walking. He turned and looked at Balek with the calm of a person who is about to say something clearly and has decided not to soften it. "A child lived in a maintenance corridor for 8 months and attended no classes and had no name in any official document," he said. "If that is what management looks like, I am not interested in it." Balek looked at him for a long moment. His mandibles moved in a slight, thoughtful pattern. "Probably," David said. "I'm also going to keep teaching. I find I can do both." He walked on. That evening, one of the Varith for a Selith Upper Ring student named Orith, who had enough standing in the academy to view most things as either beneath him or in need of correction, filed a formal complaint with Headmaster Orvin. The complaint cited Accord Academic Code 7.14. It argued that an unregistered ward case had been placed in an enrolled class, violating enrollment standards, and that the preliminary sponsorship filing was itself an irregular use of a clause not designed for cross-species application. It was a well-written complaint. Orith had filed complaints before. He knew how they were supposed to sound. Orvin received it, read it, and filed it under review. He did not respond immediately. David was not aware of the complaint that night. He was at his desk, reviewing student work. Reich had turned in his first written response. 3 paragraphs on the concept of signal and receiver, written in careful, dense prose that was clearly the work of someone who had been thinking for a long time, but had rarely been asked to put the thinking somewhere. The writing was not polished. The grammar in the translated text was uneven in places, but the ideas were precise in a way that took David a moment to sit with. He wrote a single comment at the bottom. This is the right question asked in the right direction. Keep going. He put the paper in the stack to be returned tomorrow. Outside, the station moved through its quiet artificial night, and somewhere in the maintenance corridor, a small gray dragon with asymmetrical wings lay in a new spot, closer to the door, and did not sleep for a while, turning over the difference between a message sent and a message received, and whether, perhaps, the same thing could be said about a name. The complaint from Orith sat in Headmaster Orvin's review queue for 2 days before Orvin called David in. He did not call David in immediately because he was avoiding the issue. He called him in after 2 days because he had spent those 2 days reading the complaint carefully, reading the academic code carefully, and arriving at a conclusion he was not entirely pleased with but could not argue against. David came in and sat down. He looked rested. He had brought his paper notes. Orvin set the complaint on the desk between them. He did not ask David if he had seen it. He assumed David had heard about it through the same channels everything traveled through this station. The complaint is technically correct, Orvin said. Code 7.14 does require valid species recognized documentation for enrolled students. The hatchling's documentation is not complete. The preliminary sponsorship filing is intended to bridge exactly that gap, David said. The complaint argues that the sponsorship clause was not written for cross-species application. The clause does not exclude cross-species application, David said. He opened his notes. He found the section without looking hard for it. He had marked it. It says recognized adult member of the Accord. I am a recognized adult member of the Accord. That is verifiable. Orvin leaned back slightly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person who has run the argument in his head and reached the same end point. It has never been applied this way, he said. Not as a counter-argument. More as a record of the fact. I know, David said. That's not the same as it being wrong. Orvin looked at him. He said, Mr. Rail, the Verith KYN will object to this. I have already received an inquiry from Elder Draxol's office asking about the status of the Ward Hatchling's case. They will send a representative. There will be a formal objection filed. The Accord Educational Oversight Board will likely ask for a review. David said, What happens to Reich during the review? Orvin said, His provisional enrollment continues during the review period, under the preliminary sponsorship. Then I'm not concerned about the review, David said. Orvin studied him. You are willing to let this become a formal dispute. I'm willing to let the process work, David said. If the process works correctly, Reich stays enrolled. The Verith KYN case gets expedited because a formal dispute draws attention to how long it's been sitting untouched, and the Accord has to decide, officially and on record, whether its sponsorship clause means what it says. Orvin was quiet for a longer time now. He looked at the complaint. He looked at David. He looked at the window, where the station's lower ring was faintly visible in the middle distance. You thought this through before you filed? Orvin said. Not surprised. More like confirming a suspicion. Yes, David said. Orvin picked up the complaint and placed it in the response queue. He would draft a reply to Orith's filing indicating that the matter was under review and that enrollment would continue pending resolution. Standard language. Clean. Accurate. He did not tell David whether he thought the whole thing was a good idea. He did not need to. He had authorized the preliminary filing. That was, in its own way, a statement. David thanked him and left. The formal objection from the Verith KYN arrived 4 days later, which was faster than anyone had expected. It came not as a written document, but as a physical visit. Elder Draxol arrived at ALC Verith with 2 attendants and a demeanor that suggested the distance he had traveled was itself a message about how seriously this matter was being taken. Draxol was old for his species. He was large in the way Verith KYN adults were large, broad-shouldered, dark-scaled, with the kind of presence that occupied more of a room than his physical size accounted for. He requested a private meeting with the human teacher. David was given 40 minutes notice. He arrived on time. He brought no notes. The meeting was held in one of the small faculty consultation rooms. Draxol and his two attendants were already inside when David arrived. The attendants stood against the wall. Draxol stood in the center, which was a posture choice David noted without reacting to. David sat down. He did this calmly and without ceremony, because sitting was what you did in a consultation room, and he saw no reason to change that. Draxol looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You are the human who filed sponsorship for the Verith KYN ward." "I am," David said. "I understand that I am not Verith KYN," David said. "The filing isn't a bonding claim. It's an academic sponsorship under Accord Code. The two aren't the same document. They carry the same weight in practice," Draxol said. "Only if the cultural naming never happens," David said. "I'm not replacing the naming. I'm keeping a student in school while the naming is processed." "The Hatchling's case is in processing," Draxol said. David looked at him. "It has been in processing for 8 months," he said. "He has lived in a maintenance corridor for 8 months. He ate station rations alone for 240 days. He was enrolled in no classes. He had no name in any official document. When I asked the counseling liaison about him, I was told he was stable and non-disruptive." He paused. "Is that what your people mean by provided for?" Draxol did not answer immediately. The two attendants against the wall were very still. "The situation is regrettable," Draxol said at last. "But it is temporary." "It was temporary the day he arrived," David said. "It is still temporary 8 months later. I am not sure temporary means what either of us thinks it means in this case." Draxol's jaw tightened slightly. He was not a man who was told things he didn't want to hear often. He was not responding to this badly, David noted. He was processing it, which meant there was something in him that recognized the weight of what was being said, even if he didn't like the speaker. "I have one more thing," David said. "It's a simple request." Draxol waited. David said, "Say his name." Draxol blinked, both his eyes at once. "The hatchling has no confirmed name under Verith KYN registry." "I know," David said. "His egg mother called him Reich before she left. He told me this himself. That name exists whether or not your council has recorded it. It is the name he carries." He paused. "I am asking you to say it." Draxol did not answer. The silence went on for 8, 9, 10 seconds. Then David said, "I'll keep using it. I'll use it in every document I can enter it in, every time I address him, every conversation I have about this case, because it is his name. And the fact that your registry hasn't recorded it doesn't make it less his." He said this quietly, not with anger, with the specific kind of patience that is more difficult to argue against than anger is. Draxol looked at him for a long moment. He was an old creature, and old creatures had seen many things, and what he saw in this human was something he had encountered rarely. A person who had no particular status or power in this room and was not behaving as if that mattered. "You are a very irritating species," Draxol said. David said, "We've heard that." Draxol said nothing else. He turned, and his two attendants followed him out. David sat in the consultation room by himself for a few minutes. He was not certain what would happen next. Draxol had not formally withdrawn his objection. He had not escalated it either. He had simply left, which was its own kind of result. 2 days later, a notice arrived from the Verith KYN administrative body addressed to Headmaster Orvin. It was formal in language and careful in phrasing. It noted that a review of the ward case's interim care conditions had been conducted following Elder Draxol's visit, and that based on this review, the hatchling's case was being moved to an expedited processing track. The projected timeline for resolution was now 90 days rather than 22 months. It did not say the previous timeline was wrong. It did not apologize for the maintenance corridor or the 8 months of eaten alone station rations or the blank name field. It said, in precise bureaucratic language, that conditions had warranted expedited review and that the council would act accordingly. Orvin sent a copy to David with no additional note. David read it. He put it in his desk drawer. He picked up the next stack of student work to review. That afternoon in class, he taught a lesson on the idea of being heard versus being understood. He asked the students whether it was possible to be heard clearly and still be misunderstood. Most said yes. He asked whether it was possible to be misunderstood for a long time and still be right. The room was quieter on that one. Reich said, from the back, If there is no one to understand you, being right does not help. David said, it helps later, when the right person is finally there. He continued the lesson. He did not look at Reich longer than at anyone else. But after class, when the papers were collected and the other students had left, he noticed that Reich had stayed again. He was looking at the front board, where David had written the lesson's central question and left it up. The question was, what does a message need beyond a sender? Reich looked at it for a while. Then he picked up his things and left. The scratch marks in the maintenance corridor were still on the wall. But that evening, Reich stopped adding to them. Not because he was finished, because he had somewhere else to put the words now. And the heat cloth stayed near the door. And for the first time in 8 months, Reich did not go to sleep in a place that felt like the furthest point from everything. He went to sleep in a place that was at least on the way. 90 days is a long time in a maintenance corridor. It is a short time in the life of an administrative council. David understood both of these things. And so while the expedited timeline was better than 22 months, he did not mention it to Reich as good news. He mentioned it as information. He told Reich, plainly, that the Verith KYN Council had moved the case to a faster track, that the expectation was a resolution in approximately 3 months, and that his enrollment continued in the meantime. Reich received this information the way he received most things now, quietly, processing it behind his eyes before speaking. 3 months, he said. Approximately, David said. Reich nodded. He did not ask what would happen if the council's decision went against the name he carried. He did not ask what happened to unclaimed hatchlings who aged out of the system without resolution. David noticed these were questions Reich did not ask, which meant they were questions Reich had already answered for himself in the dark, probably more than once. David did not bring them up either. They were real questions, but the time for them was when the answer arrived, not before. Instead, David gave Reich a datapad from the classroom resource stock. It was basic older model, with access to the Academy's language library and a text composition tool. He said Reich could use it for class and for whatever else he needed. Reich took it with the careful grip of someone handling something they do not yet believe is theirs to keep. The weeks that followed were the quietest part of the story, in the way that growing things are quiet. Reich came to class every day. He sat at the back, but he no longer kept his body pressed against the wall. He sat upright, his forelimbs on the desk, his pale amber eyes on the front board. He answered questions when asked and asked his own questions when class ended, staying behind to put one careful question to David before leaving. David answered each one the same way he answered the ones in class. Fully, without hurrying, as if the question were the most reasonable thing a person could ask. The other students in the class adjusted to him the way students adjust to any consistent presence, slowly, and then all at once. Naro, who had gone down to the underblock to tell him about the sponsorship filing, now sat one seat closer to the middle of the room than she had at the start of the term. She sometimes answered questions at the same time as Reich, and once, when David asked them to work through a problem in pairs, she turned to the back of the room and tilted her head at Reich in the universal gesture of, "Do you want to work together?" Reich paused, then moved his desk. They worked together. Their solution was good. David said so. Oritha's complaint was reviewed and returned with a finding that the preliminary sponsorship filing was within code. Orith received this notice and did not file a second one. He was not a bad creature. He was one who had learned that certain things were simply not done, and he had tried to enforce that, and the code had turned out to say otherwise. He did not apologize to Reich, but he stopped mentioning him in the way he had been, which was its own kind of stopping. The academy did not become a different place. The upper ring was still bright and well lit. Senior students from elder race families still held their social positions. The general understanding of who mattered at ALC Verith was not overturned by a human teacher enrolling a gray ward, Hatchling, in foundational studies. But one thing had quietly changed, and it was this. David Rail treated Reich like a student, every day, in front of everyone, without exception. He called his name with the same weight as the others. He returned his work with comments written in the same ink. He disagreed with his answers when they were wrong and confirmed them when they were right, neither more gently nor more harshly than he did for anyone else. This consistency, repeated enough times, begins to rewrite what feels normal. It does not do it quickly. It does not do it with speeches. It does it the way water moves stone, not by force, but by being there. Students stopped visibly reacting when Reich answered a question. They stopped looking at each other when he stayed after class. Naro stopped tilting her head with the faintly surprised expression she had worn in the first week, as if she kept expecting the situation to resolve itself into something more explainable. Reich, for his part, used the datapad. He used it in the evenings, in the maintenance corridor, where he still lived because the ward housing had not been changed and David had not pushed on that front yet, wanting to be careful about how many things he pushed on at once. The corridor was the same, but Reich had arranged the small space differently. The heat cloth was near the door. His writing materials were in a stack near the wall, organized. The condensation cup had been joined by a second one that caught the drip from a different pipe. He had, over time, made the place into the most functional version of itself that it could be. On the datapad, he wrote. He wrote his own name first. He wrote it in Verith Kyn script, which he knew from hatching, though he had never been formally taught it. He wrote it in the standard Accord script, which he had learned from the language library. He wrote it in 3 other scripts offered by the library, learning each one with the focused patience of a creature that had spent 8 months with nothing to do but think. He wrote his name over and over, not obsessively, not desperately, with the methodical care of someone building something. He was learning what his name looked like in every script the datapad could offer, because names were supposed to be known, and he had decided to know his in every form that existed. One evening, David stayed late at the academy, reviewing term progress documents, and on his way out he passed through the lower ring. He had not planned to go to the underblock, but the light from the maintenance corridor was on, which it sometimes wasn't, and he slowed. He stood at the entrance. Reich was at the wall, but not scratching into it. He had the datapad propped against the pipe, and he was reading from it, then tracing the shape of a character on the wall with one claw, very precisely, comparing what he wrote to what was on the screen. Writing his name, practicing it, in a script David didn't recognize from this distance, something that curved in long, flowing shapes. David stood there a moment. He did not make a sound, but Reich sensed his species had good peripheral awareness and looked over. David did not say anything about what he had seen. He did not make it a moment. He simply walked forward and placed his hand briefly on the small gray hatchling's shoulder, the way a person does when words are not the right tool, and then he stepped back and looked at the datapad. "Which script is that?" he asked. Reich said, "Felhuri." Naro showed me the character set. David looked at the shapes on the wall. They were careful, precise. The lines were even. "It looks right to me," he said, "though I don't read Felhuri." Naro said it is right, Reich said. She checked. David said, "Good." He stepped back. He looked at the corridor, the heat cloth near the door, the organized stacks, the 2 condensation cups. Then he looked at Reich. "I'm going to ask Pessa about the ward housing this week," he said. "I should have asked sooner. I was managing too many things at once, and I let that one go too long." Reich said, "I do not mind it here." "I know," David said. "You've made it yours. That's not the point." Reich looked at him. "What is the point?" "The point," David said, "is that you shouldn't have to make the best of a maintenance corridor. You should have a room." He said it plainly, without heat, just as the next thing that needed to be said. He left shortly after. That week, he asked Pessa. The process for moving a ward student to actual student housing required the counseling liaison sign off and a note from the enrolling instructor. David provided the note in writing. The counseling liaison, who by this point had developed the expression of a person who had decided it was easier to agree than to resist, signed within a day. It took another week for the housing to be arranged. The room was small, on the lower ring, nothing exceptional, but it had a door that belonged to Reich, and a window that looked out at the station's exterior ring where stars moved slowly through the viewport in the long artificial night. On the day Reich moved in, he carried his few things from the maintenance corridor in 2 trips. He stood in the new room for a moment, looking at the window. Then he placed the data pad on the desk, put the heat cloth on the bed, and set the condensation cups in the small washroom, where they were no longer needed, but where he put them anyway, because they had worked and he did not believe in discarding things that worked. He sat on the bed for a moment. He looked at the window. Then he opened the data pad and wrote his name in the 7th script he had taught himself, which was a flowing one from a species he had never met, learned from a library entry at 2 in the morning 3 weeks before. He wrote it carefully. He compared it to the reference. It was right. He put the data pad down and looked at the stars. He was still a ward case. He was still waiting for the council's ruling. He still had no formal name in the Verith KYN registry, and that absence still meant something in his people's cultural law, and he knew it, and it still hurt in the specific way that absence is shaped like you hurt. But he was in a room, with a window, and a door that was his. And in a classroom 3 levels up, a teacher had his name written in a notes field, a comments field, an instructor reference field, and an emergency contact list in which David Rail had placed his own name next to Reich's, which was not standard practice, and which Pessa had noted with a particular expression before entering it without comment. It was not everything, but it was there, and being there is where everything starts. In the faculty corridor, Instructor Balek passed David without stopping, but he did not. Once, briefly, in the manner of a person making a small concession they have decided not to announce. Somewhere in the administrative network of the Verith KYN Council, a case file labeled Hatchling Ward 7/Verith KYN/unclaimed was moving through expedited review, passing through hands that had not touched it in months, being read now with the specific attention that gets applied to things when they become visible. 90 days had been the estimate. 63 had passed. The ruling was coming. The document arrived on a Tuesday, which was the station's standard midweek administrative day, when most formal correspondence moved. Pessa received it in the morning, read it twice, and then walked it down to David's classroom by hand rather than sending it through the internal system. This was unusual. Pessa was not a person who made dramatic gestures, but she had been the one to enter Reich's name into every available field on that first evening, with an expression that had been impossible to read, and she had been the one to process the ward housing transfer, and the enrollment confirmation, and the instructor reference update, and the emergency contact list that wasn't standard practice. So she walked the document down herself. David was between classes when she arrived. He was at his desk, grading papers, with a cup of something warm that had mostly stopped being warm. Pessa placed the document on the edge of his desk without speaking. He looked up. She nodded once at the paper, then left. He picked it up. It was from the Verith KYN administrative body, addressed to Headmaster Orvin and copied to all parties in the sponsorship filing. The language was formal, the way the language of very old institutions is formal, precise, a little stiff, every word carrying the weight of the process it had come through. But the content was clear. The council had reviewed the case under expedited procedures. They had examined the record of the hatchling's intake, his time in transitional housing, and the documentation of his pre-registry name. They had found, under subclause 14.7 of Verith KYN Cultural Naming Law, a subclause that had existed in the records for over 2 centuries and was rarely cited, that a name given by an egg parent to a hatchling prior to the formal bonding window, and repeated by the hatchling as a self-reference, carried provisional name status. Provisional name status was eligible for formal registry confirmation without a full naming ceremony, provided the hatchling confirmed the name as his own before a recognized witness. The council had designated Elder Drax Soul as the witness. The confirmation had been scheduled for 3 days from now. If confirmed, the name Reich would be entered into the Verith KYN naming registry as the hatchling's official name. Full enrollment documentation would follow. Academic sponsorship would be formally concluded, as it would no longer be necessary. The hatchling would be a fully registered member of his species with complete identity documentation. David read the document once. He put it down. He picked up his pen and went back to grading papers. He finished the stack before the next class. When his students came in, he set the papers aside and taught the lesson. He taught it the same way he always did: questions first, facts after, then the part where students were asked to think and tell him what they had thought. Reich was at his usual desk, which was no longer the furthest one in the room. Over the past weeks he had moved, one desk closer each time, in increments so small that no one had noted them. He was 3 desks from the front now. After class, David asked him to stay a moment. The other students filed out. Naro glanced back at the door on her way, then looked forward and kept walking. David handed Reich the document. Reich took it with his careful grip. He read it. He read slowly, which was not because he was a slow reader. He was reading the way you read something that contains a word you have waited a long time to see treated as real. He read it to the end. He set it on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "They found a subclause." "They did," David said. "It has existed for 2 centuries, Reich said. "Yes." Reich was quiet. He was doing the calculation that David suspected he had done, which was that the subclause had always been there, and the expedited review had been triggered by a formal dispute, and the formal dispute had been possible because of the sponsorship filing, and the sponsorship filing had happened because a human teacher had read the code carefully and found a gap that no one else had bothered to look for. He was doing all of this in his head, in the space of a few seconds, and David let him do it. "You did not tell me you were doing this," Reich said, "when you went to meet Draxol." "I didn't know if it would work," David said. "I didn't want to tell you something that might not happen." Reich considered this. That was... He paused, searching for the word. "Careful," he said. "I try to be," David said. Reich looked at the document again. He ran one claw very lightly along the line where his name appeared. Reich. Printed in the formal type of an administrative document, recognized. Real in the way that official things are real, which is a different kind of real than the kind that was already true. He said, "On my world, names are given by the clutch. They mean you are claimed, that you belong to something." David said, "I know. I read about that." Reich looked up. "On your world," he said, "why do humans ask names?" David was quiet for a moment, thinking about it in the honest way, not the quick way. "Because it means you're worth knowing," he said. "When you ask someone's name, you're saying, I want to be able to find you again in my mind. I want to be able to talk about you. I want you to be a person I know, not a person I passed." He paused. "It's a small thing. It just doesn't feel small when no one's done it." Reich sat with this. He looked at the window, where the station's outer ring was visible, a slow drift of metal and light against the dark. "It is a strange custom," he said. Reich said, "I think I prefer yours." He said it without drama, and David received it the same way, and neither of them made it into more than it was, which was a true thing said between two people who had arrived at a kind of understanding that did not need to be announced. 3 days later, Reich stood in a small ceremony room in the formal wing of ALC Verith. Elder Draxol was present, and 2 Verith KYN witnesses, and Headmaster Orvin, and Pessa, who had come without being required to, and Naro, who had asked Reich if she could come and had received a very short yes, and David, who stood at the back of the room in the way of a person who has decided that this is not his moment to be in the front of anything. The ceremony was brief. It did not involve fire or flight or the elaborate clutch-binding rituals that a full naming would have required. It was the simpler, older form, the provisional confirmation. Draxol spoke several phrases in Verith KYN that the translator rendered as something along the lines of, "This name has been carried, and it is given back in formal acknowledgement." Then he asked Reich, in plain accord language so the record was clear, whether he confirmed his name to be Reich. Reich stood straight. His asymmetrical wings were folded neatly at his back. His pale amber eyes were steady. He said, "Yes, my name is Reich." Draxol entered the confirmation into the registry device. The device chimed once, a clean and simple sound. That was it. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Afterward, in the corridor outside, Naro said to Reich, "I have your name in 3 scripts now." Reich said, "I have it in 9. Naro looked at him. 9. "I have been practicing," Reich said. Naro laughed. It was a quick, bright sound. Reich looked at her, and the corner of his mouth did something that on a Verith KYN was the very beginning of what might become a smile, if practiced enough. They walked back toward the lower ring together. David watched them go from the doorway of the ceremony room, then turned to find Draxol standing nearby. The elder looked at the 2 young figures moving down the corridor. He said, without turning, "The subclause had been in the records for 230 years. David said, "I know." Draxol said, "It was never invoked." "No," David said. A pause. "Why did you read far enough to find it?" David said, "Because I needed something for Reich, and I believe that what you need is usually somewhere in the document. You just have to read the whole thing." Draxol turned and looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a very old creature that has just been surprised by something that probably should not have surprised him. He said nothing further. He inclined his head, once slightly. Then he walked away. That evening, David filed his end-of-term student progress reports. The stack was the same kind of work it always was: student names, performance notes, attendance, recommendations. He went through it the way he went through all paperwork, carefully and without hurry, saying what was true without extra words. When he reached Reich's file, he opened it. The name field now showed Reich, properly populated, black type on a clean field, no asterisk or pinning flag. The species registry field was confirmed. The enrollment status showed full and active. In the instructor notes field, where he had once asked Pessa to put a name where no official field would accept it, he wrote the final comment of the term. Student demonstrates exceptional precision of thought and a growing willingness to ask questions in shared space. Engages deeply with material and pushes beyond the question as given to the question underneath it. Recommend continued enrollment. High potential. Known. He submitted it. He stacked the rest of the papers, turned off the classroom light, and walked out. The corridor was quiet at this hour. His footsteps were the only ones. The station moved on in its long, slow orbit, and somewhere in the lower ring, in a room with a window that looked out at the dark and the slow drift of stars, a small gray dragon, hatchling with asymmetrical wings, sat at a desk with a datapad in front of him. He was not tracing shapes on a wall. He was writing a response to the first lesson of next term, which David had posted early, because that was something David did. The question was, what is the difference between being heard and being understood? Reich read it. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about 8 months in a corridor, and names in 9 scripts, and a man who had sat on a floor at the same level and asked him what to call him, and whether that was being heard or being understood or something that was both at once and could not be pulled apart. Then he started writing. He wrote until the station's artificial night was fully dark and the stars outside his window were the only light. He wrote his name at the top of the page first. He always did now, not because it was required, because it was his, and it was real, and the world had said so, and before that a human teacher had said so, and that had been enough to start with. His name was Reich. He was known. And that, in the end, had turned out to be the thing that mattered most.